So I'd like to welcome everyone to Framing Learning, Problem Solving, and Innovation in Kindergarten with Joel Seaman. I can guarantee you are going to have an absolutely fantastic night of learning and inspiration. It's always wonderful to hear people coming here and meet people coming from all over Ontario to join us for these professional development sessions with OTF Connects. So I'm going to mute my mic and turn it over to Joel and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much. And I would like to also echo that welcome and thank you all for being here tonight. I think I've done about 4 or 5 webinars now for OTF Connects, and it's always a really fabulous time, a learning experience for me as well, and a nice opportunity to connect with educators from all over the province. I love that map part, seeing where you all are from. I always like to start a little bit about me, just to give you some context for some of the learning we're going to take on tonight and a little bit of my journey so far as an educator. So I am a teacher with the Toronto District School Board, and I've been teaching for them for 6 years now. During those 6 years, I've been lucky enough to have been in kindergarten, and I really do mean lucky enough. I know it's an early year session tonight, so likely I'm preaching to the choir, but you all know that kindergarten is a truly fantastic and inspiring and exciting place to be, to really cultivate this learning in, you know, the smallest little humans is something that I really don't take for granted and I really do enjoy. I do teach on Toronto Island, and I like to always mention that early in the session because I find if I mention it later, once it comes up, no one wants to talk about the topic anymore. They just want to ask me about taking a boat to work. So yes, we do take a boat both ways to work year-round, even through the snow and ice, but it is worth it. It makes for a really unique location for our early learning. Needless to say, we do a lot of outdoor exploration being on the island, which very much factors into our inquiry and the problem solving and innovation we're going to be discussing tonight. Before we do begin, I do think it's important to mention that I am in no way an expert on this topic. In fact, I firmly believe that there's really no such thing as an expert in education. And really, for me, that's one of the most exciting things about this job is that, you know, you never have it all figured out. There's always more to learn or more questions to ask or, you know, a new student who comes into your space and makes you really question what you thought you knew. So I'm not here tonight to tell you the right way to do problem solving and innovation in your classroom. I'm simply here to tell you what has worked for me on my journey as an educator in my practice with, you know, the unique students that I work with. But that being said, I want to recognize that we are a room full of knowledge and experience, and it is my hope that my voice is not the only one heard tonight. No one wants to hear me talk for an hour and a half, and I certainly don't want to talk at you for an hour and a half. So there's lots of moments for dialogue built in tonight, and those are, for me, always the richest moments in these OTF Connects webinars is when I get to hear from you. So please, as Molly said, there is the chat box to the side. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts, questions, comments, anything you'd like to add in there. Just so I know my microphone is working and I'm not talking to myself right now, can everyone give me a hello or a hi in the chat? Hi, Aaron. Hi, Krista. Hi, Jessica. Ooh, that's coming fast and furious. Hi, everybody. Fabulous. So like I said, please feel free to take part in the chat. There's some moments built in where I do want to hear from you with specific questions. Hi, Karen. But feel free to chime in throughout the night. Like I said, it's a lot more meaningful when we engage in that discourse rather than just a single voice. So tonight we're going to be looking specifically at problem solving and innovation in kindergarten. As we know, it is one of our 4 frames of learning in our brand new Ontario kindergarten document, which you'll hear a few times tonight. I am a huge fan of. I bring it around with me when I do in-person presentations, and my copy of it now is pretty beat up, but it's something that I reference daily. We're going to pull from it tonight. We'll be starting off with a little more of the theory, looking at those 4 frames, like I said, with a specific focus on problem solving and innovation. But we are going to shift, and the majority of what we're looking at tonight are practical examples from practice. So we're going to be looking at the problem solving and innovation in action with some examples from our classroom community. I find that those practical examples, for me, when I'm on the other side of this and I'm a participant, are really the most valuable moments of learning. So we'll just do a bit of theory off the top, but like I said, we'll be shifting into some practical examples with a focus towards the end on documentation. I do like to start with a minds-on, and today I found a video that I think is really relevant to what we're going to be looking at tonight, and it might be a nice start to our session this evening to kind of turn our thinking towards these ideas. So Molly will actually be pasting the link for the video into the chat box window, and once you see it, you can go ahead and click on it. It will open up in your browser, so you can have a look at it there. It's a YouTube video, and once you are finished the video, come on back and respond to it in the chat. And there's the link right there. So go ahead and take a look. Hopefully you enjoy it, and come on back and let me know what you think.
Imagine the awesomest.
So as the video ends, feel free to make your way back to the chat. Oh, I see some responses coming in already. Thank you, by the way. I really appreciate having all of you partake in the conversation. Yeah, Margaret, I've seen it a few times. I won't lie, I get a bit teary-eyed sometimes, but it's so fantastic. And like I'm seeing in the chat window, such an important reminder about the big picture of why we do. Why we do what we do, and also really the importance of kindergarten and the early years. Absolutely, Krista. This idea that the questions are really more important than those answers, and that's something that's going to come up a lot tonight in what we're talking about. Yeah, absolutely, Christina. I find this a very powerful one to share because it takes on a positive tone, you know, and I think it would be hard for any educator, regardless of their beliefs, to look at this video and not get excited about, you know, inquiry-based learning. Chris, I've turned up my volume now. Do you find that a little bit better? Fabulous. Thank you for letting me know. I think this video also does a really nice job of highlighting the very real learning that takes place in our kindergarten classrooms when we talk about play-based learning. You know, often play can become a bad word of, oh, no, we're not playing. Well, no, we are playing, and that's a very powerful and rich thing because through that play, through that hands-on learning, that experiential learning, is how students really formulate ideas about the world around them. It's how they make their theories. It's how they spark wonder and curiosity. So I'm happy that you all responded well to that video. It's certainly one of my favorites, and I think it's so in line with what we're going to be discussing tonight. Oh, that's a great idea. to share that in an orientation. Yeah, that would be very powerful, I think, for families as well. As we move along, I've pulled a quote from the Ontario Kindergarten Program, kind of as a second minds on. It connects very much to what we saw in the video, but I wanted to include it because it comes directly from our program. And it says, children entering kindergarten bring with them the capacity to wonder and imagine and the ability to discover and experiment as means of finding answers. When children are able to explore the world around them with their natural curiosity and exuberance, they are fully engaged and see themselves as contributing members of their world. This creative approach is a central aspect of both problem solving and innovating. As we speak about our Ontario Kindergarten Program, we are all aware that one of the biggest changes in the structure of it is that we are now looking at 4 frames of learning as opposed to what it was before in the older curriculum document, which was separate curriculum areas. We had language, we had math, we have science, and we still very much have all of those things. And when I talk to people about the new kindergarten program, I often mention what I just said, which is that it's structured in a new way. There is some new content, of course, but it's not a brand new program. It's just a different lens. So we are now looking at it through 4 frames. And in the kindergarten program, 4 frames, or broad areas of learning, are used to structure thinking about learning and assessment. The frames are designed to support an approach that aligns with the way children's learning naturally occurs and that focuses on aspects of learning that are critical to young children's development. The frames reflect the integrated way in which learning occurs during children's play and inquiry in kindergarten. And speaking of the 4 frames, here they are. So we've got belonging and contributing, demonstrating literacy and mathematics behaviors, self-regulation and well-being, and of course the one that we are looking at tonight, problem solving and innovating. However, before we take a closer look at problem solving and innovating, I wanted to do some thinking as a group. When we look at this new program document, which I've already confessed to loving, and it's my hope that you all love it too, I want to hear from you a little bit on why we think the ministry might have made this shift. So the shift I'm referring to, and we've got a graphic here looking at it, is up top. That line you see, that's from the old curriculum document. We had personal and social development, we had language, mathematics, science and technology, health and physical activity, and the arts. We've now shifted to the 4 frames, which is a pretty significant shift in structure, but a very important one, and one that was made for some very specific reasons that are rooted in research. So I'm curious if you want to chime in the chat, why do we think the ministry might have made this shift in our new program document? Awesome. So there's some great thinking coming, and I'm going to scroll up. Heather, I love what you're saying about it. It's hard to sometimes separate the learning that we see in play into these distinct categories, right? And what we know about the 4 frames is there's often some overlap. So it's not even necessarily just belonging and contributing. Maybe we're seeing that while we're seeing the literacy behaviors. Maybe we're seeing self-regulation in the way they're problem solving and innovating, right? But whereas prior to this, it was very kind of these distinct categories, which doesn't always work for play-based learning. Yeah, Caitlin is referencing the cycle of learning, which is so important. And Patty, for sure, looks at the child as a whole. So important. I love, thinking about that. I love that it's a circle. That's a really important and relevant change. Yeah, Karina also mentioned the overlap in the 4 frames. I think that's so important. Wow, amazing thinking from all of you. Thank you so, so much. Like I said, I love learning from all of you. I love hearing your thoughts. So thank you all for taking part. Yeah, Susan makes a really great point, which is that language and math are important, and certainly in our new program, it's still, one quarter of what we're looking at. But I love that something like well-being is also one quarter of what we're looking at. I think that's so important in the world we live in, and that we're honoring things like problem solving and innovation. Thinking back to that video we watched off the top, it's just as important as the reading, the writing, and the counting. Fabulous, fabulous thinking from all of you. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas. Margaret raises an interesting point too, which is that kind of gap we sometimes see between kindergarten and grade one. And does grade one have to be a fully new way of learning? If our program is telling us that, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds learn best through play and hands-on inquiry, that doesn't change when we go to grade one. We have to look at how we can bring these ideas up. I think that's so important. Yeah, great point, Paula. It's that experiential learning, it's that hands-on piece that really deepens the knowledge. We can tell students something and they can regurgitate it back to us. But going through that process, which is so, really what play-based learning is all about, really deepens that understanding. In the interest of time, I'm going to flip ahead to the next slide. If there's any more thoughts that want to be shared on this specific topic, go ahead. I really, again, appreciate how active you're all being in the chat. It really, really makes for a more meaningful webinar. So thank you again for sharing your thoughts. As mentioned, we are spending tonight honing in on one specific frame because all 4 of them would be pretty difficult to get into an hour and a half. And I will also tell you it was difficult just to get problem solving into an hour and a half because it's a pretty big idea. So we are going to look at some specific pieces from the actual program document, and a little later on we will look at specific examples from practice. I know we've been having some conversations in the chat window, but as Molly mentioned, we can actually use our text tool, which is the 4th one down, to type on the page. Let me give it a go. There we go. So if you'd like to select your text tool, I'm hoping to kind of build a slide together with you, just responding to this initial question of what comes to mind when you think problem solving and innovation. And there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. I just want to get us thinking about that now. So some awesome, awesome thoughts coming through on the screen. Nice to see the mention of blocks and also loose parts. Those are certainly two topics we're going to explore tonight a little later in our session. I love to see the idea of experimenting and exploring, and collaborating is there as well. I think that's a really important aspect specifically to problem solving, that it's not an isolated activity. We're doing it as a learning community. We're collaborating and sharing our thoughts. Things not fitting in my backpack. Yeah, it's that idea of real world problem solving. And why do we have to be problem solvers? Why do we have to be innovators? Because there's very real moments in life where these skills come in handy. Trial and error, that's huge, that's so important. And the trial and error piece connects also with growth mindset. I saw it somewhere here. Oh, there it is. Absolutely. The idea that sometimes things take multiple tries. And that's not a negative. In fact, through a problem-solving innovation lens, that's actually a positive, because it means we're refining our ideas through trial and error. And our thinking is getting stronger. And when students and teachers have that growth mindset, it allows us to really view the mistakes as a valuable part of the learning experience. I love the mention of language here. Right? When we talked about those 4 frames earlier, we talked a lot about the overlap. So often, teachers feel stressed, oh, I have to get the reading, I have to get the writing, I have to get the oral language done. Well, that all happens through our problem solving and innovation. That happens through our inquiry. Outdoor play, absolutely. Being on the island, I'm very big on that. I have to say, this group tonight might be my most active group I've had. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And pat yourself on the back, because it means a lot. There's some fabulous thinking here. Grit, yeah, so important. Oh, I love this. Getting messy, making mistakes. It's like a Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus. So important. We always tell our students, sometimes learning gets messy. That's fine. I mean, we tidy it up after, but that's another story. The questioning piece is huge, and knowing that there's not always the right answer. And what I always tell families is, being able to find an answer is important, but being able to think critically about an answer and evaluate the appropriateness of an answer, which all comes out in problem-solving innovation, is even more important. In this generation where students can Google whatever and come up with, 300 results, students don't need to know how to find an answer. They can already do that. Students need to know how to think critically about the information that's coming in. Oh, Molly, thank you for doing the screen capture. I love this. I love all the thinking that's going on this screen. And again, thank you all. You are definitely my most active bunch of participants, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Good stuff. All good things. I think we're all on the right track with our problem solving and innovation. And it's neat because a lot of what you've put up on the screen now is actually going to come out later tonight when we look at some of those practical examples. So for those of you who are still typing or hoping to get something up, I'm going to let you know I will be flipping ahead in a couple of seconds. I just don't want to cut anyone off. Awesome. So a lot of what you've already said comes out when we explore the front matter in our new program and how it relates to problem solving and innovation. So what the program says is that this frame encompasses children's learning and development with respect to exploring the world through natural curiosity in ways that engage the mind, the senses, and the body, making meaning of their world by asking questions, testing theories, solving problems, and engaging in creative and analytical thinking, the innovative ways of thinking about and doing things that arise naturally with an active curiosity, and applying those ideas in relationships with others, with materials, and with the environment. And that the learning encompassed by this frame supports collaborative problem solving, that came up already, and bringing innovative ideas to relationships with others. That social learning piece. In connection with this frame, it is important for educators to consider the importance of problem solving in all contexts, not only in the context of mathematics, so that children will develop the habit of applying creative, analytical, and critical thinking skills in all aspects of their lives. And this is something that I purposefully pulled to put in tonight's presentation, because sometimes when educators hear problem solving, we do think specifically about math. And of course, problem solving has a very, very big role in mathematics. There's no denying that. But what makes this frame so interesting to me is it's not only looking at problem solving in math, but we see a lot of problem solving in language learning and emergent literacy behaviors in our young students. We see tons of innovation in their work at the art studio. And the reason why I bolded and underlined all aspects of their lives is because for me, problem solving is so much more than the math or the science or the STEM. For me, in kindergarten especially, there's a very, very large focus on social problem solving. And how do we use our problem solving and creative critical thinking skills in our social relationships, you know, as our young students are kind of navigating. Yeah, there it is in the chat, problem solving on the yard at recess. For me, when I hear problem solving, I of course think of all of these things, math and science and language, but for me, the social learning is really where this comes alive. And I'm going to show you an example from practice a little bit later. With your clip art tool, which if I'm not mistaken is the bottom one, you can go ahead and select one of the common symbols. I'm just curious. I thought it would be an interesting way to read the room. I've picked 6 emojis, as you can see on your screen. Which one would you say most relates to the way you feel about problem solving and innovation in your practice? And you can just go ahead and choose one of the common symbols and place it where you feel best. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. If it's something that perhaps you struggle with, you know, I want to be able to talk about it tonight as well. Awesome. So I probably could have guessed this based off the awesome conversations that you've been having already, but there's lots of people who love problem solving, innovation, who feel great about it. I like to see a lot by that kind of thoughtful emoji face too. I think that's a pretty interesting one to look at. Something we're still thinking about, which is a positive thing. Now, I know that for many educators who have recently made the shift to our new kindergarten program, it can feel daunting, you know, and something that I always show when I'm doing in-person presentations is I'll often hold up the old curriculum document, which if you've seen it in person is relatively thin, and I'll hold it up beside our new program document, which is much, much, much thicker. And to me, that's a positive, you know, it's really that expanded front matter, which really digs into the research behind what we do. You know, that shows, you know, play-based learning and inquiry is not just something fun that we're doing. I mean, it is, that's a bonus, but there's a great deal of research behind this as the optimal way for rich learning in the early years. But I know that thick program can sometimes be daunting for people to dig through. So knowing that many of us are still on a learning journey around wrapping our heads around what problem solving and innovation looks like in our program, what I've done, and you'll see it on the next slide, I just wanted to talk about it before I flip ahead to it, is I've created a Wordle. So for those of you who don't know, a Wordle is something you can create online. Sometimes it's called a word cloud, but essentially what it does is you can paste in a body of text. And what I've actually pasted in was the entire problem solving and innovation frame. Everything that our program document says about it. And what it does is the words that appear most often in that block of text, so in this case, the frame of problem solving and innovation, appear larger in the graphic. So I'm going to flip ahead so you can see the word cloud or the Wordle for problem solving and innovation. And in the chat, I'm curious, what do you notice? What emerges? What do you wonder about? What surprises you? What are you happy to see there? Keeping in mind that the larger words are what appear most often. I thought this might be an interesting way to kind of synthesize and summarize everything that our program is saying about problem solving and innovation. So as you can see, children is the largest, and I was doing a presentation on all 4 of the frames last month, and I've done this for each of the frames. And what's interesting is children is actually the largest in all 4 frames. I love that. Questions, yes, of course, you're seeing that. Questions is a big one. In fact, questions is bigger than answers. I think that's pretty meaningful. It's this idea that, once upon a time in schools, teachers were kind of the transmitters of knowledge, but, more so now, we're the facilitators of knowledge. And it's often our students and their families that bring this thinking to us. Process theories. It's interesting because the tiny ones are so small. I almost want to get a magnifying glass. I got to make a bigger version of this. Oh, I do see answers. Oh, look how tiny it is. It's at the very bottom. Let me get my pointer tool out. Do you guys see that? It's down there. That's so interesting. It's much, much smaller. I love that. Play is pretty big. I know someone in the chat mentioned opportunities. That's great. Theories. We're big on theory building. And a shift away from kind of right answer, wrong answer. Risks. Yeah, good noticing, Krista. That's an awesome one. Likely in the coming days, I'll be sharing all 4 of these Wordles on my Twitter, which I'll link to later. I just thought it was an interesting way to kind of get a quick idea of what's within each frame. And certainly there's some things that I expected to see here. Something surprised me when I think about problem solving and innovation. Materials here, that's something we're really going to touch on when I show some examples from practice. We're going to talk a little bit about the purposeful materials we can use to kind of spark problem solving and innovation, specifically with kind of open-ended materials. These here, this again comes directly from our Ontario Kindergarten program, and these are the overall expectations for the problem solving and innovation frame. And what's interesting, and we've already mentioned, is there's a lot of overlap. So some of these expectations also exist within other frames, which really speaks to the whole learning that we mentioned earlier. So take a glance through them. I put them now because in a little while we are going to shift to practical examples from practice, but I thought this might be a nice lens to kind of keep in mind as you're looking at photographs from our learning community. What do you see represented directly from the program? So I'll give us a few minutes just to glance these over. Yeah, interesting observation. Susan's noticed that math is only mentioned in one. And if you think about that quote I pulled earlier from the program document reminding us as educators that problem solving is of course part of math, but when we look at problem solving and innovation in kindergarten, it's really related to all aspects of their learning. You know, problem solving is so much more than the kind of traditional math word problem we might think of. It's science, it's technology, it's engineering, it's language, it's social learning, it's art, it's all of these things. One last little bit of theory from our program before we shift to the practical examples has to do with children's engagement with problem solving. And it says children develop problem-solving strategies from first-hand explorations and from exchanging ideas with other children and with adults, all of which can help them to see things from different points of view. Children develop working theories as answers to their questions by observing and listening, and by exploring, discussing, and representing. Their theories become increasingly useful for making sense of the world and for giving them some control over the problem-solving process. Children's innate capacity to ask questions and recognize problems may in fact encourage them to make connections that lead to innovative thinking and solutions that are meaningful and relevant to them. That relevant piece is so huge for me. Their resilience and initiative develop as they persevere through many attempts at solving a problem. As children gain greater experience, knowledge, and skills, the theories they develop become more widely applicable and have more connecting links between them. They approach problems with the optimistic attitude that a solution is possible and with the confidence that they are able to create that solution. And that's where that growth mindset piece comes in. I'm just going to go ahead and take a drink of water before we flip to the next slide. All right, I promised some practical examples because I know as an educator that is often a helpful thing to see. I will say again, this is not, the right way to do problem solving and innovation. I don't think there's such thing as an expert. I'm simply showing you what has worked for me in my practice with the students I work with. And the first example we're going to look at for cultivating problem solving and innovation behaviors in our students, it's been mentioned a few times tonight that it's super important, and it's blocks. So for as long as we can remember, blocks has been a staple in kindergarten classrooms, and for good reason. There's a lot of fine motor muscle development as well as gross motor muscle development that happens there. It invites collaboration, and certainly, as we're going to look at tonight, I believe a lot of problem solving and innovation behaviors. So this is the block center in our room. Yeah, Karina, this is we are room 109 on Toronto Island, and this was our block center in September. And I chose this picture specifically because I think it's pretty bare bones and streamlined, and for me, that's often an important way to start the year. That's something that's newer to me on my own journey as an educator. When I started, I certainly put out lots and lots and lots and lots, and I thought they needed, all sorts of materials. But I think that by really streaming it down, it allows us to be more purposeful with what we're putting out and prevent students from being kind of overwhelmed by the material. So I've really strived to create a physical space that's free of clutter and it's warm and inviting. So this was the block center in September. We have blocks of various sizes. And we always have clipboards and pencils there. Yeah, Susan, we do add more materials as the year goes on, and often we will swap out the blocks for other building materials. So when students engage with blocks, as you can see on this side here, they may build with them, or as you see on this side here, they may actually interact with them. So they're not just using their hands, but they're creating something that their bodies can engage with. Both of these examples here show a great deal of problem solving and innovation. When I look at them, for some context, on this side here, this was actually just a couple of weeks ago. Our students in our community created an obstacle course. They were calling it kindergarten fear, and it was to discover what you were afraid of. It was really interesting, and they were using the blocks in a variety of ways to go over and under and balance on, and over here they were creating a structure that they were trying to balance that top block on. So both of these show a great deal of problem solving and investigation specifically with balance. I also see some use of symmetry here. And certainly because I know this is just a still photo, but I saw the process, there was a lot of trial and error that came out as a result of this block play. Blocks are great because they can also be used in representation in play, so that, you know, a wooden block is a wooden block, but it can be so much more. So on this side here, we noticed students were creating roads. They were actually creating a whole city. You see a stop sign. So there's some literacy there. They were creating bridges. We had traffic lights over here. And my teaching partner at the time had some chalk paint. So we actually started to, not all of our blocks, but a few of them were coated in the chalkboard paint. And then we added chalk. With the thought that perhaps they would create roads, since we knew that was an interest, and you can see here they did do that. But later in the year, they would use it for signs, they would write on it, so it was kind of an easy way to kind of cultivate some more problem solving and innovation with our blocks. I mentioned earlier that it's not always just wooden blocks. Our building carpet has lots of different building materials throughout the year. And I want to mention it's not always that it needs to be kind of an expensive or a complicated or a beautiful material. As you can see here, we had a collection of old plastic yogurt containers. But I bring these out every year, and they are just a hit for the builders every time. You can see they're stacking them into a pyramid in one. Over here, they're actually outlining a student on the floor, which shows a lot about perimeter and measurement and mathematics. Yeah, Susan, we've used the solo cups as well. You'll see those later. But it's neat. It's a different kind of stacking that we get from blocks. And by switching up our materials, we can cultivate new forms of problem solving, new forms of innovation related to the specific material. So again, being purposeful with what we're putting out, not just throwing all our blocks onto one shelf, but being really purposeful kind of engages the problem solving. Another building material that has been huge in our community this year are these ramps and balls you see here. So the ramps are actually made from plastic piping pieces. Our caretakers, I have to give them full credit. They cut them down the middle and they brought them to us. So I'm so thankful to them because the kids just love, love, love these. I've got some wooden balls you see here. I bought those online for pretty cheap, but you can also use tennis balls. We've used marbles before, and the students kind of notice how differently they roll. They use the wooden blocks to kind of prop them up. They've also been really into putting them through the backs of chairs and adding signs. So when we think about our building carpets and how that can be such a major factor in our problem solving and innovation learning, it's important to remember that as great as blocks are, and I love them, they're such a staple in our classroom, we don't want to limit ourselves or our students just to wooden blocks, that we can get creative with other building materials. Christina, these are plastic piping pieces that our caretakers cut in half for us. I knew that in discussing problem solving and innovation, we would also be talking not just about building materials at blocks, but the idea of loose parts and how those can be used to kind of cultivate creative and critical thinking as students engage with them in their play. So we have loose parts available at all times. While I showed you the block center in September, these are loose parts much, much later in the year. I will tell you, I would not put all these loose parts out in September. Again, we start relatively simple, and we, practice sorting them as we put them away. We practice how we can use them, how we can care for them, and we add to the loose parts collection as our students grow and develop. So this image here on the left is from last year, I believe. This is kind of May, June, towards the end of the year. And the students use these loose parts to create a juice store. So they've got signs, they've got order forms, they were taking money, we got them some cups, and they were mixing, different loose parts as different recipes. Over here is a table that we put some brown craft paper down on and drew some lines. We often use lines as kind of a precursor to writing. For some of our students who are in the pre-writing stage, we explore curvy lines and straight lines and zigzag lines, and we look for those lines in letters, and we look for those lines in numbers. And putting our loose parts with these lines kind of invited our students to explore the concept of lines in a different way. I also love this image because some of the older students created a sign that said, "Please save, thank you," so that during tidy up it could stay there. Yeah, Jessica, the juice shop idea came from them. They were using the loose parts to create juice, and when we observed that in our documentation, we added some props to kind of extend the play. So that's when we added the cups, and we had them the materials to make signs. It was neat. This actually transitioned. We actually made juice in June, and we sold it to our school on a very hot day. The kids decided they wanted to give the money to charity. So it became this whole inquiry piece that all just stemmed from loose parts. Loose parts also have a very beneficial role in art exploration. So you can see here a student has created a self-portrait with loose parts. The cork circle you see comes from Dollarama. When we laid them down, the students noticed it looked like a face, so they began adding loose parts as eyes and nose and mouth. You see hair, you see eyebrows. It was just a different way to do these self-portraits that we do so often in kindergarten. And it really shows a great deal of problem solving in how they're using these loose parts and what they're choosing to represent different features. There's a lot of purposeful selections that seem to be going on here. I chose this image as well because when I present on loose parts, sometimes what I hear from people, and it's completely valid, which is that the loose parts end up all over the classroom. And that does happen. In cases like that, if I've got groups like that where they seem to be just taking them everywhere, a photo frame, we have a picture frame here on the table, can kind of help them contain them. But again, we are also pretty loose about letting them take them to other places in the room as long as they bring them back. And again, that's why we kind of scaffold and we start off small. We add more loose parts as the year goes on. In the same vein as loose parts, I really think in our practice a lot about how we can use open-ended materials, because to me, open-ended materials really provoke exploration. So at this point, I kind of want to make a distinction between the open-ended materials you're going to see here and more traditional toys. So there's very few what people may refer to as toys in our space, and that's something that I do purposefully, because I think to play with a toy, yes, of course, there's an element of creativity in there, but to take an open-ended material and use that higher level thinking where you're choosing to represent it as something else, to me really cultivates a higher sense of creative thinking, and as a result, more problem solving and innovation. So there's very few toys, and instead we put out open-ended materials to invite students to kind of breathe their own life into it. You know, a block doesn't always have to be a car. A block can be a spaceship. A block can be a chair. A block can be a time machine. That happened the other day in our room. So this specific image you see here, there's the red Solo cup we mentioned earlier. I had them out, again, for stacking at blocks, and the students actually started cutting it, but You know, as we said earlier, learning is messy. I went with it, and it turns out they were creating what they called a house for ants. We had found some ants on our floor earlier that day, and this became the house for ants. This piece here is a cardboard corner that came out of like a box that a TV was packed in. So I chose that too because I want people to start thinking that open-ended materials, we don't have to buy, they don't have to be fancy. A lot of things end up getting donated, and they become such meaningful parts of our students' problem solving and innovation learning. So speaking of toys, we had a bunch of students who earlier this year were bringing their toy cars from home, which is fine, but I noticed that their play kind of plateaued. They were kind of just steering them around the room, and there wasn't a lot of extensions going on. So as a simple open-ended material, I put a roll of tape on the table they were using, and before I knew it, we had the town of tape. So you can see here they created roads, they drew arrows on it as the project unfolded and built. They created lakes, there's parking lots. They made a sign. This over here was the grocery store. They cut it out of a magazine. They were calling it blah blahs, but I think they were going for Loblaws. But it became this whole month-long project in our room. This was earlier this year, and it all started with a roll of tape. So again, those open-ended materials where students can take them in a variety of directions are so meaningful and really provoke that exploration and very real problem solving and very real innovation. Yeah, Christina, the ant piece, we had to revisit because then they were making lots of homes for ants, and we discovered that they were hiding their snacks all over the classroom to feed the ants, so we revisited that one. Caitlin, we do have a storage room, yes. It's shared between our 3 kindergarten classes. Open-ended materials can also spark imagination, and imagination is huge in kindergarten, and for good reason, and certainly a huge part of problem solving and innovation. So again, donated. Donations can be your best friend from families. We had a whole giant box of just loose keys, and I put them out. This is a couple of years ago now. But the students would look at them and they started to tell stories of where these keys came from. And it was such innovative thinking. So this student here, who was an English language learner, and I think she was so articulate, picked one up and looked closely. You can see we have magnifying glasses all over the classroom. She said, oh, this key, a long, long time ago, I think it's a queen or a king, castle key. This is very dirty key and interesting. So again, a simple open-ended material that spurred all this imagination and creative thinking when students are thinking about problem solving and innovation. Open-ended materials are just as important in our art in kindergarten. So we've got an art studio in our class. The shelf is pictured here. And as you can see, we, as much as we can, try to have materials that invite open-ended art. So we stay away from any of the pre-made crafts that we may have seen traditionally in a kindergarten classroom, where students make the handprint turkey that all look the same. That doesn't really require a great deal of problem solving and innovation. Whereas if students use these materials to create something from their own imagination, by nature, they are being innovative. And through that process, they're using a great deal of very real problem-solving skills. I'm going to flip back, just because Susan is asking about this with the text on. Yeah, so we use an app on our iPads called Pick Collage. It allows you to use one image or more to make a collage, and then there's a text option where you can type right on top. So we use Pick Collage all the time in our Ped doc. Pick Collage, I'll type it in the text too. And we do share them on Twitter. I'll link to our Twitter a little bit later at the end. But it allows families to get a glimpse of what's happening in our classroom. Again, being on the island, families stay in the cities. They don't come on the boat with us. So we use Twitter to kind of give a window into our classroom. And adding their voices really adds another layer of the thinking that can't just be captured in a photograph. So we're going to flip back to the art studio. Up top, we've got drawing materials, so markers, crayons, pencil crayons. We organize them by color to kind of invite students to be a little more thoughtful with their selections. We created the self-serve tape dispenser. It's just a paper towel holder that I bought cheap from, I think, Winners. And the caretakers, again, those great caretakers, I got to shout them out. They drilled it up there for me because I noticed students in previous years would always ask for my help to get the tape off. And I'm happy to help them, but we also want to cultivate independence in a sense that students can help themselves and see themselves as capable. So this way they're able to rip the tape themselves. We've got scissors and glue always, a variety of kind of mixed media materials that can be used in a variety of ways, mirrors, pencils, paper. So we stay away from any of the pre-made crafts. Like Christine was saying in the chat, it really allows them to explore. There's also opportunities to collaborate at the art studio, so art can be a solitary experience, but it can also be a shared experience. I'm going to flip back because Heather's asking about the color sorting. So with the color sorting, I like it for a variety of reasons. Number one being, I think, in my opinion, it encourages students to be a little more thoughtful in their selections. So rather than just reaching their hand into a bin of markers and pulling whatever they get out and drawing with it, they get to think, you know, if I'm going to draw a tree, for example, what colors do I need? And it slows them down. Yeah, it slows them down. They pause and they have to make a careful selection. I also love it because at Tidy Up, again, it slows them down and really forces them to be a little more thoughtful. So we're not just throwing everything back on the shelf. We see very real math sorting taking place, but also it just builds that and it cultivates that idea of taking care of our classroom. You know, Tidy Up is not something we rush through. It's a ritual in our day, and it's how we care for our physical space. Caitlin, I've seen it both ways. I've seen them take them all and put them on the table. I've seen them take one marker at a time. I've also seen, and I want to be realistic, I've also seen all these bins mixed up. You know, it doesn't always happen like this. I mean, we've had students do the writing and create the labels, but some students won't put the red back in the red. You know, and it's not something that we police, but it's something that we encourage them to think about. So as we've already discussed, with open-ended materials in the art studio, the possibilities are truly endless. You know, there's not just one, you must draw this and you must do it this way. You can create anything. There's no limits, you know, with their creativity. So, you know, sometimes we see three-dimensional art. Sometimes we see two-dimensional art. But like the block center that you saw earlier, we're always refreshing our materials here, or swapping things out, or adding things to kind of cultivate that problem solving and to spark that innovation. There's also a real possibility for the use of open-ended materials to invite math behaviors. So the loose parts we spoke about earlier are often very popular at math. We always have manipulatives. We always have counters. These ones here are two-sided, red and yellow. This is an old large egg carton that was donated by the kitchen at our school. Again, there with the donations. But these students were showing their math thinking in a very interesting way. I love this image. There's a lot going on there that may not have been garnered from a photocopied worksheet. It's this idea of the open-ended materials to invite that hands-on learning as we explore math. These 10 frames, we just glued popsicle sticks together. and they can use a variety of manipulatives with them. And again, with open-ended materials, it allows students to take the lead in their learning. So we always have dice out at math, and like I said, a variety of manipulatives. This student at the start of the year created his own math game. And I saw him teaching it to his friends, and I actually sat down with him, and I photographed every step, and he helped me create an instruction book. And for him, it was such a proud moment. He had such ownership over his learning, and for this student specifically, he really started to look at himself as competent and capable, and he was so proud to share it with his friends. The game was whoever gets the most wooden pieces wins, so a very, very descriptive name. But I'm not sure if any of this would have been possible without open-ended materials. It allowed him to stimulate his math thinking and really take the lead on his learning. So when we talk about open-ended materials, we aren't just talking about our blocks. We aren't just talking about art. There's a very, very important role for open-ended materials at math. When we did our brainstorm earlier about what comes to mind when we think about problem solving and innovation, I saw a few mentions of STEM, or I know that we often will refer to it as STEAM as well. So science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. And certainly STEM and STEAM are such a really meaningful way to get problem solving and innovation happening in our classrooms. It allows students to explore real-world problems and real-world tasks and really see their learning make a difference in the world around them. So this specific challenge you see here was set up, I believe this was last year, may have been 2 years ago, after reading the book Iggy Peck, Architect. So if you're not familiar, it's a fabulous book, as well as Rosie Revere, Engineer, and the newer one, Ada Twist, Scientist. All really great books to kind of stimulate real STEM challenges in your classroom. So in this book, Iggy's class goes on a field trip, and the bridge collapses behind them. So I stopped reading it there. And then in our sand table, I added a little pit of water to represent the lake, and some open-ended building materials to invite students to build a way to get Iggy across the water. And I was purposeful to say to build a way. I didn't say build a boat, although some students did. I didn't say build a bridge, although some students did. But by leaving it, again, open-ended, an open-ended question, allowed them to really rise up to the challenge and represent their thinking in a variety of ways. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, those 3 books are fabulous. With regards to STEM or STEAM learning in our classroom community this year, we recently, if you follow us on Twitter, we recently set up a woodworking workshop in our classroom. So we've got a super creative bunch this year, and they love building. They love creating things with blocks. So I thought we ordered a woodworking kit that's part of the TDSB, and it comes with wood and cardboard and plastic. It comes with clamps. It comes with wood glue. It comes with hacksaws. And it's been really awesome. We talked, again, a lot about safety, and we really scaffolded students in the way we set it out. But this time we read the book Stuck, and it's about a boy whose kite gets stuck in a tree. And again, I stopped after the problem part because we are problem solvers and we are innovators. And I said, what could we build at our workshop to get the kite out of the tree? So students started with a plan. They listed their materials, their tools, and they drew a diagram of what they were going to build. This here is our workshop all set up. Again, we've got a variety of tools and materials. We've got the safety goggles and gloves because that's important. And the students got right to work. And it was such a meaningful experience for them to be a part of it, and again, to really view themselves as competent and capable. And here is a ladder that one of our students created. You can also see up here, this is neat, another student actually made a kite to stick on one of our classroom plants to represent the kite stuck in the tree from the story. But anything related to STEM or STEAM, again, that's science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, is such a meaningful and exciting way for our students to explore their problem-solving skills and think about themselves as innovators. Students love to create, and the more opportunities we give them, the better. Karina, these were rented from our lending library in the Toronto District School Board. So I'm not sure how it works in other school boards, but I imagine there's resources you can rent. So one of our resources is the technology hand tool kit, and our students love it. They're actually building their own ferry boat right now. That's where it's emerged to in the last couple of days. Yeah, the STEM piece is so big when we look at problem solving and innovation, and students love it. Another thing I'm really big on when I look at problem solving and innovation, specifically that collaborative piece we mentioned earlier, is Lillian Katz's project approach. So essentially students are following an interest and working together to create a large-scale project. What you see pictured here is from just a couple of months ago in our learning community. The students created a cave. And again, it all comes from them. So what I noticed, and my teaching partner noticed this year, was students were continually seeking out enclosed spaces in our classroom. We saw lots of students going under tables, and they would often take over all our pillows and all our blankets and kind of create these small, cozy areas. You know, and rather than just shut it down and say, no, you can't do that, I wanted to document it and analyze that documentation and try to get to the bottom of why students were engaging in this sort of behavior. And what emerged through conversations as I sat with students and looked at the documentation was that they were really interested in this idea of being enclosed. And those conversations with them quickly transformed to the idea of creating a cave. And I kind of thought, well, here we go. Let's start this project. So as projects tend to do, we began with research. Students got some nonfiction books from our librarian. But again, being 21st century learners, I always try to take them to the library, but they tell me we can just ask Siri, or we can ask, what's the new one? Alexa. They know all about it. So we actually did get online, and we found on YouTube like a GoPro camera tour of inside of a cave, and that was really cool. That sparked a lot of wonders. So you see here is our wonder wall. We mentioned earlier that in problem solving and innovation, it's not about finding the answers, it's about formulating questions. So students began this whole process with questions. What wonders do we have about caves? From there, we created a plan. We talk a lot about blueprints and prototypes in our space. So students collaborated on a plan. And then the process began. And even though it is the project approach, that end project, as important as it is, isn't really what it's about. It's about the process that happens to create that final product, where really all the learning happens. So you can see here, they got a giant box, and the first attempt, they went in and they said, it's dark like a cave, but it's too small. And you can see for sure there's lots of students packed in there. So we cut open the box, and the second attempt, they went in and they said, now it's bigger, but it's not dark inside. So again, I turned it to them. I said, well, what can we do about it? You know, let's problem solve, let's innovate. And you can see here they brought over a classroom blanket to kind of block out the light. And I chose these three images to remind you that it's not about that end product, but it's about the process where all the learning happens. They continued to design. They said they wanted different shades of gray to represent the rock. We got some donations of black fabric, so we didn't have to use our classroom blanket. But they started to create a roof and an entranceway. Here's an image from actually inside the cave. You can see they collected some rocks they brought in. Some of the rocks they actually painted with sparkles because they wanted to have gems and diamonds. They posted some bats on the wall. Yeah, Caitlin, I find in the past I have asked, but often with the project approach, I find the students are so excited about whatever it is that we're creating together that they'll often go home and tell their family. So I often don't have to ask, but the next day we have students say, oh, I brought something for the cave. Oh, I love this. A student used a cardboard box to create a bear head. So this is the bear who lives in the cave. And it's neat, you know, the project is ongoing. Even though the cave has been created, now students are really interested in creating a soundscape for the cave. So they're recording themselves, making bat noises and wind noises and water noises. So they notice, you know, our cave looks great, but it doesn't have a sound. So it's neat, you know. But a large-scale project like this is such a meaningful way to see problem solving and innovation in action in all of our students. And they have such ownership over the learning because they're taking the lead. It's not a teacher. I'm simply there to facilitate. Speaking of facilitating, that leads us directly to our inquiry stance, which is so important, not just for problem solving and innovation, but really for every element of our kindergarten program. That we, the educators, but also the students, are employing an inquiry stance. Something that I think kind of reflects that is this mystery object. So we do this a couple of times a year. When I notice our science area needs a little spark, if students aren't really doing much there, nothing is kind of holding their focus, I'll choose something interesting. So this is a, well, you know, the kids call it a chalk rock, but it's white, got lots of holes in it. We found it on the beach. We put it on our science table with the prompt, I wonder, some signs here with the question words, a magnifying glass to look a little closer, and pencil and clipboard is huge. And as students looked at it, they wondered, why does it have holes? Why is it a wishing rock? I wonder if I can decorate it. Why is it so big? I wonder how it growed. I wonder if it will turn into a robot. Maybe. I wonder if anything lives in the little hole. Ooh, or what is that green spot? How does it smell? I wonder where it came from. Is it a chalk rock? Is there sand in the hole? So this idea of cultivating questions, and this came up earlier on in the presentation, that we're not just looking for answers, but how do we formulate a strong question? How do we look at something? How do we make an observation? So these were documentation panels we created a couple of years ago to live in our science area, and they remind us that scientists make observations, so we look closely. And this is, what do you see? And recently in my practice, I've shifted to asking, what do you notice? Because I realized when I reflected on my own practice that asking, what do you see, it's just referencing one of our 5 senses. And that for some students, they make observations through seeing, but for many of our young students, it's through feeling, through the hands-on touch, or listening, or smelling. We talk about how we don't taste everything, but now instead of what do you see, I ask, what do you notice? And from there, we go to scientists make theories. A theory is a guess. What do you think? So I see, I think, and then we go on to I wonder. But I like to say theories because it reminds us that there's not a right and there's not a wrong. And often we test a theory and then we revisit that theory. But when we talk about problem solving and innovation, and we think back to that Google video from earlier about students growing up and working in these fields that we don't even know what they are yet, it's that idea of theories that are so important, and revisiting those theories with a growth mindset. In a similar vein of questioning, observing, and theorizing, we noticed one time that our classroom plant turned yellow. We asked students to kind of think about what they thought, and there were some really fascinating thoughts that came out of this. So really sitting with the student and writing down what they're saying. I know often in kindergarten we feel the pressure to get them writing, and yes, that is important, and yes, that's something we value in our program. But for so many of our young students, the writing piece can be a barrier. So if we're looking at just communication for them getting their ideas out, I find that it's so rich when we document it for them, knowing, of course, that we are balancing and teaching them writing in other moments. But I think it's so important that we just allow students time to communicate orally and not let the writing get in the way. The last practical example I mentioned earlier, the importance of social problem solving. So the idea that problem solving, although we think math and science and technology and engineering, it also in kindergarten has so much to do with our social learning. So in kindergarten, in the early years, we're navigating these social relationships, and students are learning how to make friends, how to keep friends, and how to solve their own problems. I mean, I know we all have the students tapping us on the shoulder for help, and we are there to help them, and our students know that. They know that if you need our help, we are there for you. However, you can try other strategies first. So a couple of years ago, I had a group, and I found that they were so reliant on "I'm sorry." And I have thoughts on that. I mean, saying sorry is nice, of course, it's important, but it doesn't often fix problems. And I would see it all the time in our class. In our community, kids would be, saying, "I'm sorry," and I could tell, well, you don't really mean it. Or someone would say, "I'm sorry," and then another kid with tears streaming down their face would say, "Well, it's okay." And I want to say, well, maybe it's not okay. So to kind of move students beyond this kind of script of "I'm sorry, it's okay," we created the Talk It Out table, which was a physical space in our classroom, the table, 2 chairs, that's it. And the students can invite each other to spend some time talking it out. Again, this was done with modeling. My teaching partner at the time and I would do some role playing for the class, and they would see how we would use it. But what I found was that students were really capable of talking out of their problems. And I think we often, we actually rob them of this learning when we're so quick to say, "Oh, you must say sorry, you have to fix this problem." When we give them that time to really dig in, to talk, but also to listen, is when the real social problem solving came out. And this Talk It Out table has reappeared in many years in our classroom community, and it's something that the students really use in a meaningful way. So it's an example I wanted to show of how we can think about problem solving and innovation with regards to students' social learning. So to recap, because I know there was a lot there, when we were looking at problem solving and innovation in our space, I gave some examples from blocks and other building materials, the idea of loose parts, open-ended materials and how they can be used at art, but also math and really all around the room. The idea of real-world STEM challenges where students are using those engineering skills to solve real-world problems. The project approach, so students are working together through the process of creating something and researching. Again, the inquiry stance. And lastly, social problem solving. And I'm loving the suggestions I'm seeing in the chat. These are awesome. I think students are really capable of talking about their feelings. And I think often we just kind of rush them to the "I'm sorry" part, and they lose that really meaningful conversation. One that I hear a lot in our space that I like is a student asking another, "What can I do to make you feel better?" I think that's a lot more meaningful than "I'm sorry." In terms of documenting and capturing problem solving and innovation, I wanted to put this triangle in because I think it's so important that in our documentation, we're looking at not only what the students are doing through our observations, I think that happens a lot with the photographs we take, but also what are they saying? So documenting those conversations, again, it adds another layer to their thinking. And what are they representing? What are they creating with these loose parts? What are they creating with these open-ended materials? And I think that when we document problem solving and innovation, what makes for the richest pedagogical documentation are examples of what all three, doing, saying, and representing. And yes, this Susan, this is too something I'm learning in my journey. I think I tend, or in the past, I've relied a lot on this, or this, and then students who, are comfortable speaking a lot show up most often. But what about the students who don't speak a lot? What are they doing? What are they representing? So I find myself always coming back to this triangle to ensure balanced documentation. And I think it relates specifically to how we document problem solving and innovating. I find myself for documentation too in this frame using a lot of video. If you have a classroom iPad, I'll often just set one up by the building area, or if they're working on a project or STEM, and I'll videotape it because it's so hard when they're moving so fast to kind of jot down all their conversations. So the video is nice because we can revisit it later and we can listen to what's being said and we can look at it with multiple lenses. So my partner and I will sit down and we'll see completely different things. So video has been a really meaningful way to document that problem solving and innovation piece. So in the spirit of problem solving and innovation, one of the first things that all of you mentioned, and I was so happy to see you say it, is that it's not about the answers, but it's about the question. So it's my hope that perhaps you found some answers tonight or some things that will work for you in your practice. But in the spirit of problem solving and innovation and looking at our own journey as learners, I'm curious if you'd like to use your text tool on the screen, what questions remain and what do you still wonder? Because as we know, that's how learning happens. We're going to move away from tonight's session with a few answers, but more questions that we'll explore on our own. It's great to see questions, right? That's what it's all about for our students, but also for us, because we are also problem solvers and we are also innovators when we look at our own practice. So it's my hope that tonight you do, find a few answers, but also walk away with some wonders and with some questions to guide you. And some of these questions are really resonating with me as well. Really great questioning, really great wonders. Thank you all for sharing. I'm going to end with this image. Again, it comes from the Ontario Kindergarten Program, but I love it, and I think it says a lot of what we looked at tonight. Thank you, Molly, for screen capping that. I'm going to share with you a few of the resources that were mentioned tonight, as well as my contact information for those who are interested. I am on Twitter. At Joel Seaman is where you can find me, and I love to connect with educators and see what you guys are doing as well. It's been Twitter has been an awesome tool for connecting and learning from others, so you can check me out there. IPS Kindergarten is our shared classroom account. If you're interested in seeing what we do at school, although my Joel Seaman account retweets all of it. We are #Room109, and my blog where I talk about my own teaching philosophies can be found there. This is the Lily, some of you are asking about Lily and Cats. That's the project approach over there. So I would like to thank you all for being here tonight. Like I said, and I mean it, I promise I don't say this every time, you guys truly were one of my most interactive crowds, and that means so much. I'm so thankful to all of you for sharing your thinking. You really sparked some wondering in my own brain as well, so I'm feeling like I'm walking away from this with some new ideas. Thank you for being here for the last hour and a half. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope that you can take something from this webinar and try it out in your practice. Reach out on Twitter, let me know how it goes, and again, thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Joel. Can I just talking for a second for another great session, and